For the Register, I'm Brandon Vigliarolo here with The Kettle, our weekly podcast taking a look at the tech industry and, like any good kettle of vultures, picking it clean of all the juiciest bits of news. I'm joined this week by our systems editor, Tobias Mann,
Hey.
and U.S. editor, Avram Piltch.
Hey.
And given this is being published on the eve of the largest event of the year for the world's most valuable company, what other topic do we have to discuss today but NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference, or GTC, as it's come to be known, and as it's evolved past the GPU alone and onto bigger and greater things. So, gentlemen, let's prognosticate a bit about what Jensen has cooked up for us this year. Tobias, I suppose we should maybe lead with you. You wrote a piece that was published today speculating about some of the things we might see at GTC. Now, just to be clear, this is being recorded a couple days prior to airing. This is before you've been briefed on anything. So what we're talking about here is speculative, right? Not indicative of anything you have prior knowledge about.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I will not know anything about what's going on at GTC until a little later. So right now we're just kind of peering into the crystal ball, so to speak, to glimpse what Jensen might say. On stage.
Well, we got some, pretty good guesses. I feel like you follow this space pretty tightly and have a pretty good handle on what's going on here. So I guess your first major prediction for this next 3 days here in, where was it? Is it in San Jose? I can't remember now.
Yes, it's in San Jose.
Yeah, San Jose.
It's
so the next few days in San Jose, we were saying that the big thing, one of the big things might be NVIDIA's acquisition last summer of Grok, and that's with a Q, not a K, to not get it confused with Elon Musk's AI thing. You said they haven't really talked about it much, right, since the acquisition of Grok. And so you're thinking maybe this might be the GTC where we find out more about how they plan to use Grok inside NVIDIA.
Yes, Jensen has repeatedly throughout his financial calls said that we should get more information about the acqui-hire acquisition of Grok, because they took all the talent.
Mm-hmm.
And they took all of the intellectual property and left the sales team to do what they want with that platform, which I'm not sure how that's going to work if they don't have an engineering team to move it forward. But, if they have an inference as a service platform, maybe they can rent it back from NVIDIA.
Yeah, good luck, right?
Right. But it is one of the more perplexing acquisitions that we've covered from NVIDIA. It's its largest ever acquisition at $20 billion, give or take what it actually shakes out to be.
And you were saying that it's not, there might be a bit of a mystery, right? But it seems like there's a pretty clear reason when we're looking at some of the things you've written about the acquisition, right? And it has to do with token throughput, basically.
Right. So the way to think about it is that the power goes into one of these bit barns and tokens come out. And so the obvious corollary there is that the more power you put in, the more tokens you want to have come out in order to drive some kind of profit. But there are a lot of different ways and a lot of knobs and levers to pull to do that. And you could have just an astronomically large number of tokens come out the other end of one of these data centers. But the individual experience of, for the end user might be pretty terrible. You can serve tens or hundreds of thousands of users at relatively slow speeds and do lots of tokens, but it's not a great experience. And that's a problem for a lot of the more interesting and potentially useful applications of generative AI with things like code assistants and agents, where the speed of those tokens becomes a bottleneck as to how effective they can be or how useful they can be. If you're waiting 20 minutes for your code assistant to generate some code only to find out it's not quite right and it has to regenerate that, and you're waiting another 3 minutes for it to refine it, that doesn't feel very interactive or useful. NVIDIA's chips are really great at turning out lots of tokens, the medium to, relatively quick by chatbot standards. But once you get into the regime of wanting to have hundreds of tokens or thousands of tokens, that's where Grok and companies like Cerebras have really excelled.
So Grok, basically, it makes sense for NVIDIA then to suck up their IP, because this Grok's thing it's a software-based thing, right? Grok's not manufacturing any silicon, are they?
No, they are.
Oh, they are.
Grok is a hardware company. They manufacture they call it a language processing unit at Global Foundries.
Okay, gotcha.
It has been.
So NVIDIA is going to probably be incorporating some of what they do with hardware into its, presumably incorporating some of what they do with hardware into their hardware.
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
The NVIDIA's big thing for the past decade has been this just aggressive hardware software co-design. So
Mhm.
the idea of them bringing in outside hardware and building software against it isn't entirely new. They did it with Mellanox for
Mhm.
networking, but it is different. And so I'm not sure whether or not they're going to take what Grok already has and run with it, or if they're going to design something new. I think that's one of the biggest questions. I do suspect that one of the things that made Grok so attractive to NVIDIA was that the hardware uses what's called a data flow architecture, which is not new, but it's really, really hard to program. Like lots of
Okay.
folks have tried over the years, most have failed. And so
Grok got it right, so
Grok made it work for at least for
okay.
inference. And if NVIDIA, if Jensen and his team looked at that hardware and said, we actually think we can get CUDA running on this, we might see them get that hardware up and running really quickly.
Mhm.
If it takes a little longer, it will probably end up in new designs based on the architecture.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll learn more. Oh, go ahead, Avram. What were you
Do you see this as being for inference only, or does it have any implications for training?
So for training, no, not really. Grok has always been an inference-only platform, and it's excelled in part because the data flow architecture has been able to keep the engines on that system fed, so to speak. Inference is a very bandwidth constrained workload. The faster
Mhm.
your memory is, the faster you can turn out tokens. Challenge is that you need a ton of those chips because the specific memory Grok uses is in the compute. It's SRAM. And so they have, I think, 240 some megabytes of SRAM on each of those chips, whereas NVIDIA is putting 288 gigabytes of HBM on each of their GPUs. So I think what NVIDIA will actually end up doing is using a combination of GPUs to do a lot of the compute portion of the inference stack. We call that prefill. And then they'll use some combination of GPUs and Grok derived accelerators for the token generation part of it, which we call decode.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if we learn any more this week. So, speaking of making chips or not, you were saying in that piece you wrote that that Nvidia had kind of played its hand a little earlier this year at events like, oh gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. CES,
CES, the
yeah, at
Consumer
CES where
Electronics
they kind of
Show.
yeah, yeah. When they played their little hand at that tiny little venue, right? That I often forget the name of. But anyways, no, they kind of played their hand with big top tier chips, right? So we're not likely to see any big top tier high end monster chip announcements. But you were saying that, one of the problems is a lot of their high end chips are water cooled, they're inaccessible for people who don't have the money or the space to run them. And so some of the chips that might come out may be more accessible in that they're designed for smaller operators and smaller facilities. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So we were just talking about this idea of tokenomics and the
Mhm.
economics of scaling inference as a major driver behind the Grok acquisition. That extends into how they've been designing their systems. Their systems have been getting bigger.
Mhm.
New unit of compute for NVIDIA is 72 GPUs in a rack. That is one server, so to speak. It's 140 kilowatts for Blackwell Ultra. The estimates put the new Rubin systems announced at CES at around 240, 250 kilowatts.
Those are big.
And to put that in perspective, 3 years ago, the densest rack NVIDIA had was 40 kilowatts. And that was already hard for enterprise data center operators to deal with. So,
Right.
the idea of them putting an $8 million rack that uses more, orders of magnitude more power is tricky. Now, NVIDIA still has a smaller system, it has 8 GPUs in it. But those GPUs have gotten so power hungry themselves. Estimates are around 1.8 kilowatts each. Those systems now have to be liquid cooled,
Mhm.
which is another barrier to entry for enterprises because liquid cooling is doable on small scales. You can do it in an existing air cooled data center to some extent, but it gets difficult. It adds a lot of cost because you need things like coolant distribution units, in rack reservoirs, and for an enterprise that just wants to deal with processing private customer data through with these models, they may be willing to put up with some inefficiency of air cooling. And that's just not been an option for them from what we've seen of this latest generation so far.
So a new chip with that user base in mind would probably be a very wise decision, considering, that's I don't know. I don't have the data in front of me or anything, but I feel like a lot of the biggest enterprises they've adopted their AI, right? A lot of who's still kind of on the fence about it are these smaller outfits who may not have the space or capacity or need for something that intense.
Do you
Right.
see it going on-prem?
What's that?
Do you see it being used on-prem by enterprises, or do you think it's still gonna be in the data center?
Well, so none of these systems really you're going to see. Nvidia has workstations that are very powerful for kind of like in office use. These would be like on-prem data centers where you would see some of these HGX systems, but like yeah, you can't like I couldn't put this in my home lab in my basement.
Right. But
The
if
power
you're a if
consumption
you're a if you're a small scale enterprise that has a data center, a small one, or you're
or a
coloing
c-
somewhere nearby, or
or a computer room or a colo or like
yeah,
those kinds of things where you have to control the data sovereignty for one reason or another. There are a lot of enterprises in the financial sector that they can't go to OpenAI and take their API. They can't
right,
go to AWS and rent that compute. They have to have it kind of in their control. And so
right.
that's the market for these smaller systems, which are still 3, 4, $500,000 each,
Mhm.
are at least a little bit more accessible than the 3 to 5 to $8 million rack systems.
Sure,
The air
yeah.
the air cooling element is really important though, and it's
Mhm.
interesting with this generation. High level kind of specs on Rubin announced at CES was it was 5x faster than the last gen Blackwell in the same form factor, same number of memory chips, same number of compute dies on the chip. So my theory is that they could basically cut that in half, make something
Mm.
that looks a lot more like an even older chip, like an H that would have a low enough power consumption that it could be air cooled and still deliver 2.5x the performance.
Yeah, again, that's another thing we'll have to wait a couple days and see, what comes of it. Speaking of chips and performance, you were also talking about possibly a new standalone Vera CPU too. That's a possibility for announcement as well, right?
Yeah, we NVIDIA teased this a couple weeks ago with Meta, Meta being
Mhm.
the first customer to deploy its CPUs at scale.
Right.
NVIDIA's had CPUs for a couple of years now, but they've been mostly focused in tight conjunction with their GPUs, integrated directly onto the same board as them, or sold to kind of for use in supercomputers and scientific institutions, labs, and that sort. They haven't really tried to go after AMD or Intel in the data center space until now. Meta is deploying Grace, which is the chip that they already have. But
Mhm.
NVIDIA also has Vera, which is brand new this year. And it's I believe, an 88 core part custom a chip developed in collaboration with ARM. There's a lot of question as to what that system's going to look like beyond those kind of high level details. NVIDIA has historically integrated its memory directly onto a submodule. They call them super chips, which is unusual for a data center class product. Typically, you see memory DIMMs, modules of memory that slot in next to the CPU in Intel and AMD stuff. They're using effectively laptop memory.
Right. So
We
this could
also
be another
don't know.
chance for NVIDIA to sort of differentiate itself in this space,
Right,
maybe.
right, right.
Yeah.
There are benefits to those approaches and cons to those approaches, but it will be really interesting to see how they package that because it is a very different kind of CPU than we've seen from Intel or AMD.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that we're going to get more details on it because I suspect Meta is not going to be the last to sign up to deploy NVIDIA CPUs in their data
Oh,
centers.
sure. Sure, sure. I mean, I can imagine this being another sort of like, it's another area of expansion for NVIDIA. It's already kind of taking over the chip market. Why not seize control of the CPU space as well? One thing that I understand you do not expect there to be much of a shout out from is to those poor, poor souls who made NVIDIA what it is today, and that's video gamers. We don't expect any kind of good news for them about chip availability or new units. That's you were predicting that it's gonna be high and dry for them at this year's GTC, huh?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks were hoping to see the RTX 50 Super Series chips a refresh from last year. Typically, they do a mid cycle refresh for those parts,
Mhm.
and just the memory crunch has just hit everybody. And I mean, those even the 50 series GPUs are exceedingly expensive now compared to what they were last summer.
Yeah.
I don't see them launching that into this market right now, especially when those same the same chips that are used in those parts can also be sold at 2 or 3 times the MSRP for use by people with workstation requirements, people with smaller
Mhm.
enterprise servers. The margins, they can absorb the extra cost of the memory in those workstation and data center class products that they just can't meet the price requirements for that
Consumer.
gamers are going to tolerate.
This is painful for PC gaming.
Oh, absolutely.
It's really painful for PC gaming as a pursuit, right? Because if you can't get if you can't afford to buy a GPU, you're probably not building a PC. There are not a lot of people building
Right.
PCs with integrated graphics. And if you can't afford to buy
No, not if you're a
RAM,
gamer.
and if you can't afford to buy RAM, you're not building a PC. So where is all of that energy going to go? It could go into console gaming, or we could see more people do cloud gaming.
Yeah, it could be a good thing for the cloud gaming space, which again, Nvidia owns a significant chunk of, right?
Hmm.
I was part of, disclaimer here. No, I was part of the beta for GeForce Now way back when it was still a closed beta product, and I have managed to hang on to a very very cheap rate for my service. I don't even use it very much anymore because I have a Steam Deck that I use for most of my gaming needs. But yeah, every once in a while there's something that I can't play on there, and I got to turn back to my GeForce Now, and I'm glad to have my founder's rate
Yeah.
locked in. I will never cancel that service just because it is. If I go back and want to use it again, it's gonna be far more money.
Now might get, we might see Nvidia throw gamers a little bit of a bone. You might recall earlier, I think it was last year, that Nvidia announced a partnership with Intel that involved, about $5 billion investment in
Mhm.
the ailing chip maker. And part of that was that Nvidia was going to offer GPU dies for integration into Intel SoCs.
Uh huh.
And so there's also been a string of rumors that NVIDIA's been working on a ARM-based SoC for that would be sold as a Windows product. We've already seen that chip in some workstations, the
Hmm.
DGX Spark and the GB10 workstations that came out end of last year is one example. With 128 gigs of memory and a starting price around $3,000, that's not exactly accessible.
Yeah, that's not
Um,
going to be in the next Steam Deck, I don't think. Right.
no, but we might see a consumer version of that. The Wall Street Journal reported something to that effect a couple weeks ago with, a more reasonable amount of memory, probably like 32
Hmm.
gigabytes or 48 gigabytes. And the GPU die on the GB10 and the DGX Spark is about this equivalent to a 5070. So it's not a slouch. It'd be
Yeah.
among the most powerful integrated graphics processors available.
Nice.
They would have a hard time making the numbers work. That's what I think. I think they would have a hard time making the price work because people don't like to spend a ton of money on a gaming laptop. So you're going to try to put that much RAM in a gaming laptop. And now you're also trying to sell it to people who want to run Windows on ARM, where not every game plays on Windows on ARM. And right now, Qualcomm has something like 1% of the market share in with their ARM-based laptops. So I don't know that it's really in NVIDIA's interest to get into this market right now. Maybe it was in their interest a year ago. Maybe it was in their interest 2 years ago. And of course, I think there was some kind of exclusivity agreement between Microsoft and Qualcomm where you couldn't make a Windows on ARM laptop unless you use a Snapdragon processor.
Hmm.
Now I think that's going away. So you will be able to use something like NVIDIA processor, which would be cool to see, but I think they're gonna have a hard time making the numbers work because I don't think people are gonna be willing to spend 1,500, 2,000, $3,000 on an NVIDIA ARM chip laptop when they're more likely to go out and get an Alienware laptop that has discrete NVIDIA graphics in it. I think it's gonna be a hard sell to people to try and get gamers who are willing to spend that kind of money to spend it on an unproven platform.
Yeah, oh, totally
Yeah.
fair. But either way, we're not going to probably find that out at GTC, right? That's probably something that's a future discussion for future events.
Maybe. I mean,
Maybe we'll
they
see.
could
We'll see.
reveal it.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see. But let's kind of get past sort of the specifics about what we're thinking about what's going to happen at GTC, and let's talk more really quick to kind of wrap this up. Let's talk a bit about sort of just what the general trend. Nvidia has been in a lot of spotlight this past year, past couple of years with the AI boom, with everything going on. I feel like, Jensen Huang is a household name now in a way that he wasn't even just 2 or 3 years ago. This company's going big. I mean, what can we expect to see this year at GTC? Just kind of as a theme. Is it Nvidia all in on AI? Are we looking at something novel, or is this just going to be more, more inflating of the bubble?
The claw. The little green aliens from Toy Story pops into my mind every time OpenClaw comes up because um,
Think it's going to be all
I,
things OpenClaw.
I do think so. NVIDIA is rumored to have been working on its own version of it that is
Hmm.
presumably safer and less terrifying to use,
That'd be nice.
allegedly called Nemo Claw. I strongly suspect that they are going to spend a lot of time on stage talking about OpenClaw, its significance, and kind of driving home the practical applications of AI beyond chatbots. I think
Hmm.
we're
Right.
moving past that, and we're starting to see AI agents actually doing things and being better defined. And OpenClaw is a really just immediate, easy example to point to because it is so flexible to a terrifying degree.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, OpenClaw has a ton of problems, right? I would love to see more about how NVIDIA thinks it can make it safer, but still just as effective. I mean, do you think that NVIDIA is actually going to come out and go public with their own version of OpenClaw, or is that something you think that sort of OpenClaw and that level of autonomy in agents is going to be a big thing, kind of generally?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of risk management that has gotten in the way of AI adoption.
Hmm.
If you put an AI agent in charge of your customer service and you don't put adequate guardrails and somebody negotiates the price of a truck down to $1. Well, the law says that's a contract and now you got to get lawyers involved. Nobody wants to do that.
Right.
OpenClaw is just another completely other angle of this where it's just like the thing could drain your bank account if you gave it access to it. It could email your boss and, push back too firmly because it got bad
Yeah.
information. I think there's a lot of demand for a company to come in that has a lot of software experience to put those guardrails in, provide those tools and some assurance that yes, bad things can happen, but they're less likely to happen if you're using our software. And NVIDIA's software play is really, really simple because you buy their hardware, you get their subscription, and you have access to everything.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, a lot of that software isn't even tied to the subscription.
Yeah. So this could be, I mean, this could be a whole new direction for NVIDIA, right? And getting into the personal assistant game. I mean, they have AI. I mean, NVIDIA has their own AI models, right? But I mean, I feel like this
Oh,
would be a big, big jump in a different direction.
I don't think so.
No.
And I
Okay.
guess it's often a point of confusion. NVIDIA develops its models as a kind of a baseline that
Okay.
people can take and use as a blueprint to build something of their own.
Hmm.
Whether that's fine tuning those models on your own data or what have you. I think it's going to be the same idea with kind of a Nemo Claw type offering is that they're going to offer it as a blueprint to
Hmm.
customers to say, hey, here's a pre-validated, uh, you know, open claw like agent that has a lot of guardrails that we've thought long and hard, probably not that long, but I don't know. I don't know how you calculate the mental capacity of letting an LLM do the thinking for you. I mean, you could just
Right.
like it thought for 1,000 virtual years on how to make this safe. But I think that there's a lot of desire for those kind of pre-baked blueprints that provide some assurance that you're not just grabbing some random GitHub repo off the
Hmm.
internet that, you're going to find out 6 months later that, well, actually, it stole all my customer data and decided that, it was going to send it all just randomly after 6 months to someone in China or
Yeah.
Iran or North Korea.
Okay. So in this case, that makes sense, right? From NVIDIA's perspective, it's just another baseline model that you can use. That's probably designed and optimized for use on its hardware and its systems.
Yeah. And I think
Cool.
we'll also see that kind of thing with every year. Jensen gets on stage and he will be joined by robots.
Hmm.
So he can talk about embodied AI. He's going to talk about using making digital twins that are
Oh, yeah.
visualized and virtualized so that you can build your data center, your AI bit barn. It's like a data center tycoon 2, where you can go in and lay out your bit barn so you know exactly how much power and where, are you going
I'm
to have
in as long as
issues?
there are achievements.
So if
Yeah.
we were to have a GTC keynote drinking game, what would be the phrases that you would have to drink for? I think digital twin, the more you buy, the more you save.
He's changed it recently. The more you buy,
Hmm.
the more you make, I think is what he's saying now. But yeah, it's I think agent or agentic, I think would be I
Oh
think
my
I would be
god.
on the
I feel
floor
like
by the time the keynote
yeah, I
was
was gonna
over.
say agent or agentic, you're gonna be drunk in the first half of the keynote. That's a surefire way to lose.
Yeah.
Well, we will see what actually is said on the floor in San Jose next week. Tobias, you'll be there to cover it, I think, all week, right?
Yeah, I will be there, boots on the ground, and talking to all the fine folks that have made Nvidia the richest company in the world, and
Yeah.
see where they're going to take it next.
And luckily, we're here to ride their coattails to success. All right, guys, we'll maybe talk about NVIDIA come the end of the week. Do a little wrap up of what we actually heard, maybe, or something else might come up in the meantime. Whatever it is, we will be here to talk about it on the kettle, and we will see you next week.